Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar series, where we will cover bee vectoring technologies. The company is listed on the CSE under the symbol BEE. My name is Babak Pedram of Virtus Advisory. I'm joined today by my colleague, Corey Cohen, and of course, the CEO of bee vectoring, Mr. Ashish Malik. We will take approximately 20 minutes to walk through the investor presentation and then open the floor for questions. Should you have any questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to send them using the Zoom Q&A function found in the bottom of your screen, and we will make sure to get to them at the end of the presentation. As a reminder to our viewers, this webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be made available on our corporate website and also on Virtus Advisory's YouTube channel within the next 24 hours. With that, I will hand over the call to Mr. Malik, the CEO of bee vectoring.
Thank you, Babak, and good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending on which time zone folks are in. I'm really happy to give you an update about BVT. Just as a reminder, there will be certain statements which could be forward-looking or answers that follow the presentation that could be forward-looking as well. So do use those in the cautionary manner that you all are used to. So the agenda for this morning, I'm sorry, I'm going to say morning because I'm out here in California. It's still 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock in the morning. We're going to cover 5 different areas, a quick introduction of the BVT technology. I'm hoping most of the folks on the call are somewhat familiar with our technology, so we'll move quickly through that, highlight what we set as the 2021 objectives back in the fall of 2020. And then spend the majority of our time giving you an update on where we are on commercialization with particular emphasis on the United States. And then a few comments on partnerships and long-term objectives. And then I'll turn it back to Babak and Corey, and we will have a moderated Q&A session. So just as a quick reminder, we are operating in an extremely attractive sector called sustainable agricultural ag tech. This is a portfolio of technologies that globally are being looked at to deliver more sustainable and more productive agriculture for the future. And quite simply, the goal is to double the productivity of every acre of farmed land, but in a more environmentally and responsible way. There's something like $20 billion of private money that's going into this sector on an annualized basis, and that's not to then speak of the public money through the big public ag companies that are also investing their R&D dollars in this area. BVT is a core ag tech company. We're the only company that has an EPA approved biological control agent on the one side, but also a very unique and natural delivery method whereby we deliver the biological control agent to the flowering crops using an all-natural process, the process being the natural pollination process of bees. We have proven that this technology can deliver up to 30% increases in yield for the farmer and reductions in the use of chemicals and pesticides in general by up to 98%. And of course, on top of that, the environmental footprint of this technology is very, very small. We don't use any water, no reliance on heavy machinery, and of course, it's an all-natural and biological system versus chemical. The overall market landscape for biologicals in agriculture is very large. Whether the products have a pesticidal effect or a fertilizing effect or a biostimulant effect, the total opportunity for biologicals globally is estimated at $240 billion. We operate in a space that's closer to 20 billion because we don't have possible solutions for fertilizers at this point in time. How does our technology work? It's very simple. We have our biological control agent, which is formulated into a special powder called Vectorite. And the Vectorite powder is placed in trays which are strategically located near the exit of the beehives. And we have a solution for bumblebees and one for honeybees. And in both of these systems, when the bees are leaving the hive to forage for their food source, which is the pollen and the nectar in the crop, they walk across a tray containing the Vectorite powder, pick it up in their bodies, they fly with the Vectorite to the crop. Once they reach the flower, they bat their wings, they pollinate, they crawl on the flower, and through that process, the biological control agent falls from their bodies, colonizes the plant tissue, and through that process protects the crop against different diseases, and in the future, potentially also different insects and other pests. And the bees, in the meantime, will return back to the hive, and the whole process repeats itself every day during the bloom period for the crop. It's a very targeted way to deliver the biological control agent. We don't have any wasted product because the bees will only visit the flower, which is oftentimes the entry point for the pathogen. So you actually get the control agent directly to where the pathogen or the pest wants to attack the crop, as opposed to spraying, where you may be spraying indiscriminately over a whole acre of a field, and only a tiny percentage of the active ingredient will land on the flower. And we've actually modeled this and we've demonstrated, and here on this slide, you see an example for strawberry production in Florida, where a grower will spray every 6th or 7th day a chemical spray. And during the course of a 2.5-month season, they may spray something close to 4 kilograms of a chemical pesticide onto every acre of land. We've compared that against the targeted delivery system for BVT, where we've got the equivalent disease control. And because we're delivering the product in such a targeted way just to the flower, we're only using 20 grams of our biological control agent to get the same efficacy. So you can see we're actually applying only 1/200th of the amount of an active ingredient. And oh, by the way, that active ingredient happens to be a non-toxic, totally safe biological control agent versus a chemical pesticide. So this is the power of NTEMO vectoring, insect vectoring, and in our case, bees are the vector, so bee vectoring. The system is now fully commercial in the US. We're going into our second full season post EPA approval. We're already getting tremendous feedback from our growers. We priced our system to target giving growers somewhere around a 12 to 13 times return on investment. And that's very much in line with the expectation for a fruit and vegetable grower when they invest in a new technology. What we're finding is in certain cases, the growers are actually even getting a higher return on investment. There's a great testimonial from a grower in Georgia, where he actually has seen 25% increase in yields, which translates to a 22 times return on investment on their operation. And starting last year, he has converted his entire operation, 100% of his acreage, over to BVT. And you can certainly get to this testimonial through our website. We'll also send around the link when we do a follow-up following this webinar. Okay, so our 2021 objectives, when we sat down as a team and I sat down with the board, for 2021, we came up with this list of objectives. First and foremost is our revenue journey. And we have an objective for 2021 of invoiced sales and committed sales, so invoice sales plus committed sales of $1 million. And let me explain what I mean by that. What I'll talk about in the next few slides is the journey to revenue in agriculture. Whenever you've got a new technology, takes several seasons. And typically what you do is you work with a grower on a smaller percentage of their acreage, you prove the system out, and then once you've proven the system out, you will gain a commitment for increased acreage for the next season, right? So by the nature of the fact that we are, in the second year of launch in the Southeast, and even in our first year of launch in the Pacific Coast, as well as some other regions, we really cannot expect to get 100% of a grower's business the first year. So what we can expect, however, is do a small scale commercial demo trial, but then gain their commitments for increased acreage going into the next season. So think about it as a run rate. So we want to get into a run rate of $1 million by the end of this season. And that'll come through, high retention of the customers that we did business in last year. increasing acreage, a significant number of new growers, and as you'll see in a minute here, first revenue in the Pacific Northwest. The objective for 2021 was to secure the regulatory approval in California, which we have already announced. We actually got that just before Christmas, fully registered and licensed as of January 1st in California. So that's great news because it is, as you'll learn, the biggest opportunity for us, certainly in North America. And to take that license and start engaging with growers using trials and demos. Secure the Swiss registration is a third objective, and then complete the regulatory submission for Mexico would be the fourth objective. And we'll talk about these in a little bit of detail as we move forward. Before we talk about the commercial progress in the US, just a few quick comments on COVID-19. We've often been asked about what impact the pandemic has had on us. The good news is agriculture, of course, is considered essential, right? So certainly food supply is one of the things that folks are recognizing has to occur. And so that puts us in a good place because we're still able to service our customers. Although, to be honest, it has changed the way we've engaged with our customers and with our stakeholders. So of course, sales has been impacted. Farmers are very used to face-to-face interaction with the manufacturer's reps. So we've had to deal with that, oftentimes switching to Zoom or FaceTime or very limited travel. On the regulatory side, there have been certain regulatory bodies that have slowed down because their scientists are working from home. And so some processes have slowed down a little bit. And on the R&D side, we work with a lot of universities to validate our technology, and they have certain limitations on what they're able to do. So there have been some issues which we have been able to navigate, but by and large, we are still able to service the business and move the business forward. Okay, commercialization update. This first slide is a very important slide where I want to kind of, let people on the call understand the process that it takes, the sales adoption cycle. So this is not the same as Apple introducing a new iPhone and everybody flocking to the stores to buy one. To get a farmer to adopt a new technology takes several steps, and typically these steps occur over several seasons because the crop only grows once a season. And so it's kind of a four-step process. You start with an awareness stage where you're talking about showing proof of concept, doing some demos, doing trials with the key influencers in their geography, and then moving to a pilot stage where you may be giving some product away for free or doing 2-for-1 campaigns just to get the farmer to start using your product on a small scale. And then you move to a launch stage where you're really in commercialization. You get real clarity on the value proposition, such as the example I gave from Win Morgan, whose testimonials on a website where he said 25% yield increase and 22 times return on investment. You kind of hone in on that value proposition in that third stage. And then finally, by the time you get to the fourth stage, you're in full quote unquote sales mode, where you're trying to increase the acreage, you're trying to recruit new customers and so on. So the revenue expectation as we go through these four stages is something like this. In the first stage of building awareness, frankly, you're not going to see any revenue. On the pilot stage, you might get some small revenue because, like I said, you might be doing launch campaign programs and you start that revenue journey. By the third season, you start seeing revenue from influential growers. And that's a very important stage because at that point, you're now, you've picked the growers that you're doing business with. They're really getting experience with you on a larger scale. And ultimately, through word of mouth, your business then expands as it goes into the fourth stage, where you're now talking about increasing penetration, market share, new customers, et cetera. So as we think about the berry market, so I think most people have understood that the berry market is our first priority group of crops. And when you look at the berry market in the United States, you see that there's several different markets, from California, which is the biggest opportunity now, Michigan, New Jersey, the Carolinas, Pacific Northwest, Florida, and of course, Georgia. This chart shows the acreage in each of those growing regions. The size of the bubble, the size of the blue bubble, represents the relative size of the acres for each region, and you can see that in the tabular form. And then along the x-axis, you can see where we are for each of those 7 microregions in that 4-stage process, okay? And on the y-axis, you see the number of customers that we are actively engaged with in that given stage. So ideally, what you want is all these bubbles to be in the top right corner, right? Which we've been able to show and demonstrate for Georgia. But we need to recognize that we're just starting in markets like California or in New Jersey. We're at the relatively early stage. So our job and our sales and marketing people's jobs is to progressively move these bubbles from the bottom left to the top right, okay? And if we do that successfully, here's what you can see. Here's what you could expect. Now, here we've drilled down even further in the blueberry market in Georgia. And in Georgia, we've now reached the stage of expansion, right? So in 2021, which is just season has just started, we've just kind of installed something like 2,000 hives in Georgia last week. That journey, as we went from awareness to pilot to launch to expansion, went from 1 grower to 2 to 11 to 24 growers. The treated acres have gone from 8 all the way to 900, which we will be doing this year. But what's very important is to understand how big those 24 growers are. We've reached a point where those 24 growers, even though are currently buying for only 900 acres, because some of them are still, quote unquote, testing and evaluating on a smaller percentage, they do ultimately represent 4,000 acres. Okay, so as we expand the share of wallet with these customers in the subsequent years, we will hopefully be approaching closer to that 4,000 acre number. Now, I want to make a quick comment about Georgia, because in the previous slide, you would have seen a number for Georgia being about 17,000 acres of blueberries. We believe that our true addressable market is closer to about 8,000 acres. And the reason for that is because a lot of the blueberries that are grown in that 17,000 acre number, frankly, are wild blueberries that don't get pollinated. They just are picked for frozen, processed berries. So that's really not a target market for us. The target market for us is closer to about 8,000. So it shows that in 2021, we're already talking to growers that are representing 50% of the market in Georgia. And that number will only keep increasing as we progress through the sales process. I wanted to segue into some comments that show this opportunity is not limited to the berry market in the US. We are already expanding and started doing R&D and to understand and field development and trials in other crops. So for sure, we have a very good opportunity, tremendous opportunity in tree nuts. There's over 1 million acres, 1.2 million acres of almonds that are pollinated in California every year. There's an established $300 million annual pollination services industry. So we want to play in that space, and we will play in that space. Oil seeds, there's over 1 million acres of sunflowers. It's a relatively low value crop. So we have to really, fine tune the economics and understand how many hives we need per acre of sunflowers. And we're doing that work now. And canola seed production is another opportunity. Tree fruits, it's quite fragmented. There's a lot of different crops, but we believe we have a very strong opportunity in cherries or in plums and prunes, and we will start doing some work this season. It is mostly on the Pacific Coast and in Michigan. And then finally, we do have opportunities in vegetables, including greenhouse production in tomatoes and peppers and melons and squashes. Okay, California, we got the registration in late December. The California process is actually quite stringent, and California is not 100% reliant on the federal EPA registration. They run their process independently of Washington, D.C. and their scientists are extremely rigorous. It was great that we were able to complete the process this year or last year. It also is the only state in the US that looks at efficacy data. So it actually, the fact that we got the California registration speaks to the strength of and the credibility of our system. We have now, through this process, gained access to the largest agriculture market in the US. And also, it is a longer season. So our revenue with the berry crops is more short, between January and maybe April and May timeframe, because that's when the berries are blooming. But in California, the season is actually longer. So we have other crops that we can actually get into later on in other times of the season. Our objective is to initially talk to the key University of California researchers and to secure trials not only with them, but most importantly, with the significant growers in the target crops. We are already in discussions and have secured some and will secure more trials, at least 10 to 12 trials in blueberries, caneberries, strawberries, and almonds. And we'll be talking about and announcing those as they are confirmed in the coming weeks. Beyond berries and almonds, our next area of focus in California will be pollinated stone fruits. I talked about plums and prunes and cherries. And then further down the road, explore opportunities in greenhouse vegetable production. Mexico, a few comments on Mexico. It's a tremendous opportunity. Again, it kind of hits the sweet spot in terms of berries and tomatoes, where we know we have a strong play. The regulatory process in Mexico is not very predictable, to be candid with everyone. We have submitted efficacy trials. We submitted those late 2020. That's the first step of the process. The second step is once they've reviewed those, you actually do the formal submission for the regulatory approval. Now, what we have heard is that Mexico is one of those countries that has been hit very hard by COVID-19. And so their regulatory authority offices are operating at a much reduced capacity. So we are unfortunately subject to some delays at their end. We do expect to be able to submit in mid-2021 when they're ready to receive our dossier. And we've been told that it's about a 2-year registration review process. But again, Mexico is not one that is extremely predictable. But while we're doing this regulatory work, in parallel, we are doing trials and demos with the key berry and tomato growers, which are progressing very nicely. We've got some early results, which are very, very favorable, and they kind of match exactly what we've seen in the US. Okay, a few comments on partnerships and longer term opportunities. So partnerships are extremely important in agricultural inputs. We are a relatively small team when you compare us against our peers. So, and we're focused on R&D and development and of course, commercialization to prove the revenue in the US. But ultimately, in order to accelerate revenue and in order for us to expand into other geographies, we are talking to partners. And we have about 12 to 13 different partnering discussions that are going on. These are go-to-market type negotiations or discussions where we might give distribution rights in a particular country to a partner that will invest to bring the BVT system to market in their home country. We are also talking to a few players that are interested in some commercial partnerships in North America that will beef up our marketing muscle and allow us to reach through different channels, some growers or some markets where we're currently quite weak. And then of course, other agreements under portfolio expansion, where we're talking to third-party companies that have biological agents that will expand the pests that we can control beyond our own Vectorite with CR7. In some cases, the portfolio expansion, we're talking to companies that have already products that are already registered. So it'll allow us for quicker entry into the European market. And that's extremely critical because to get the EU registration can take several years, 3 to 4 years. So to the extent that we already have a partnership with a company that's got a product that's registered, we could enter the market that much quicker. And then we're also looking at, adjacent markets like seed apply technologies of foliar sprays. And these are all active discussions that are going on. In particular, in 2021, we have 4 or 5 discussions where we expect some closure one way or the other, either closure with a signed agreement, which we could announce and execute against, or we would know that the partnership didn't work, but then we could pursue other partnerships that cover that same geography or have a similar product portfolio. So it's a very important, this licensing in and out of technologies is extremely important way for us to accelerate revenue. So where does this put us overall in our journey to build a great company? And we could say now quite categorically that we have closed the chapter on the early development stage, right? So the first stage in our evolution where we validated the technology, secured the IP, the regulatory approval is now behind us. As we go into 2021, we are in that commercialization phase where we're talking about revenue growth, crop expansion, some commercial partnerships. And while we're in this phase is when we will get to break even. And then finally, the third stage is really when we start bringing in product extensions, global approvals, and strategic partnerships, and truly become a player in a much bigger expanded geography. And with a presence not only in North America, but in Europe, in Asia, and possibly in Latin America also. We have identified market moving milestones, and we know what those are. We had 3 in the late 29 through 2020 timeframe where we announced the EPA approval, initial sales in California. And we know that, Mexico, country distribution deals, obviously the Swiss registration, in licensing are all extremely important milestones that we will be announcing over the next couple of years. And in parallel to that, of course, the revenue journey will continue where we are, we've already talked about the $1 million invoice plus committed revenue target for 2021. And then that number will keep growing in the future. So this is what we don't want to put numbers against share price evolution, but it gives you an idea of how we view value creation over the next couple of years. Okay, and with that, I'd like to close, just recap by reminding folks that we are in an extremely exciting space. We are a key to the future of ag tech, which we've already shown is a large multi-billion-dollar market opportunity. I haven't spent a lot of time talking about IP, but we do have a very strong patent portfolio and a scalable technology, and that actually enables a lot of the in-licensing and partnership discussions that I touched on. We are in full launch mode now. We've got some selected expansion projects that we're working on. What's exciting is we are actively now a player in the industry, and we engage with partners, which will also allow us to accelerate revenue as we move forward. Okay, with that, I conclude, and now I'm going to turn it over to Babak and Corey.
Great, thank you, Ashish. I remind our audience that they can submit their questions through the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom of their screen. Our first question asks, since you have now the official approval also from California, do you think that there will be a positive impact on commercialization in 2021, or is this too early due to particular reasons?
Yeah, it's a great question. California, of course, is a super exciting market, right? And for those that don't know that, I actually live in California. I'm just outside of Sacramento in Davis, California. And I was super excited when we finally got that registration. The nature of our technology is one that until you have the registration, it's very hard to do open field trials. If this were a chemical spray, the R&D folks can use nets, and they could isolate certain plots so they can do R&D work and really kind of hone in and do demos that way. But with bees, you can't limit the bees and where they fly in that manner. So we have to be able to do demos on a large outdoor scale. And the reality is you can't really do that until you got the license. So now that we have that California license, we can actually do those large scale trials. So these demos that we're in the process of securing, and remember that the season's kind of immediately upon us. So we got this license in January. We had a bunch of phone calls that were ready to be made, which we did make, and we were able to secure, at least 10 trials, and I'll talk about those. We'll be able to announce those in the future where we know exactly the timing on them. And so what's realistic for 2021 in California is trials with key growers with positive outcomes, and then gaining their commitments for the following season. So revenue in California in 2021, I'd be delighted if we can get that, but if we do get it, it'll be quite small. But for sure, we will be getting commitments for revenue as we get into full-scale launch in 2022. We're also in the process of finalizing recruiting somebody for the California market. So we will have boots on the ground going up and down the Central Valley and the coastal valleys in California as well.
Great, thank you. Our next question asks, when using the CR7 product/system, is the productivity or the total crop yield the same as when using chemicals? I know that the productivity of an organic farmer is about 50% compared to conventional agriculture. This is at least the case for vegetables, potatoes, onions, and the like. Not sure on how this impacts berries.
Wow. Yeah, no, that's a good question. Somebody has obviously done their homework there. Yes, it's a fair statement that organic agriculture, people say, is not as productive as conventional, although that gap keeps shrinking. And I don't think that 50% number is accurate any longer. What we have found is in berries, our customers kind of use our product in two different ways. In one scenario, they use our product in lieu of the chemicals, right? So in that scenario, they are actually, in a sense, getting equivalent disease control or equivalent yields that they may have been using with the chemical program. But of course, what they're saving is the cost of the chemicals, the sustainability advantage of not using those types of products and getting a more environmentally responsible type of a crop production system. So that's one scenario. In the other scenario, there are growers that are actually doing an additive where they're using the BVT system together with a conventional program. And in that scenario, what they're actually seeing is, a synergistic effect that gives a boost to yield. So you might almost get 1 + 1 = 3. And in that scenario, you get the really higher, you're paying more because you're adding an extra cost with the BVT system, but you get that additional return because of the increased yield. So, obviously growers have different objectives on how they want to run their businesses, but the impact on profitability can be measured. And I encourage folks to go and look at the testimonial from Major League Blueberries, where he was able to demonstrate that he switched out his chemical sprays and got an increase in yield. So he got the best of all worlds, right? And he ended up with that 22 times return on investment. And then that's, of course, the objective for us to get the growers to start, moving in that direction.
Great, thank you. Our next question asks, in terms of the win-win situation for BVT and the farmers, how much more profit, percentage-wise, can farmers expect or achieve by implementing the BVT system?
Yeah, I think I kind of touched on that already in the previous question, right? So, we've priced our system and even addressed it during the slide presentation. We priced it based on giving the farmers a 12 to 13 times return on investment. And we find that that's for these specialty crops like berries or, when we get into tree fruits and tomatoes and vegetables, that's really their expectation. And that's significantly higher than a corn or soybean or cereals grower where the number is more like 4 to 5 times return on investment. So that's what we are trying to deliver. You know, the experience in some cases is that growers are getting a 20 times return on investment. So that's the win-win. The win-win is, you know, we are providing them a technology that is allowing them to be more profitable. But of course, as a society, we are all benefiting because the chemical load on that acre of land is dramatically reduced. And what we're also seeing, by the way, is that the quality of the fruit in some cases is better. So we believe that not only will the farmer be able to get a higher yield, but they can also command a higher price because the berry might be bigger or juicier. And those are some of the parameters that we will be tracking as we move forward.
Great, thank you. Our next question asks, what are our company's plans for Europe and in particular Switzerland? Does an application or approval in Switzerland, I should say, ease the application process for the rest of Europe?
Yeah, that's a great question because actually, I mean, I talked about Switzerland in our list of 2021 objectives and I didn't really have a slide on it. So this is a good question. Allow me to speak to that. So, you know, we submitted for the Swiss registration in 2018. Regulatory approval processes take 2 to 3 years. What's good is that in Switzerland, starting, I would say, you know, summer of 2020. And by the way, we've also heard and felt that the Swiss process has slowed down because of COVID. But starting the second half of 2020, we actually started getting questions from the examiners or the reviewers in Switzerland, which means that they were fully engaged, right? They were looking at it, they had questions. You got to remember that nobody has ever submitted a label that looks quite like ours for a product delivered using bees. So it automatically triggers a series of questions that we are working through with the authorities. We just, in fact, sent a response to their second set of questions back to them last week. So I'm cautiously optimistic for a 2021 decision in Switzerland, but I don't have any clarity on when in 2021 that could be. Now, the second part of that question is, how does Switzerland impact the rest of Europe? Well, I mean, so Switzerland doesn't have a direct impact on EU, right? Because they're not part of the EU. But indirectly, it does, because while it doesn't kind of influence the regulatory process for EU, where it can have an impact is as Swiss growers start using the BVT system, you know, we can automatically see a scenario where growers in their adjacent countries will watch and they'll be able to see the experience from the Swiss growers. So once we do get the allowance for, you know, Italy and France and Germany and Spain, we will be able to point to the experience from the Swiss growers and hopefully have a quicker adoption. So that's why it's extremely important. And we actually talk about it as a kind of a beachhead for Europe, even though it's not an EU country. It's extremely important. The other point I want to make about Europe is it's an extremely strategic market. And there's, you know, even though to get the EU registration is going to require a little bit of work, we can still access the EU consumers through adjacent countries that export their crops and commodities into the EU, right? And so you've heard us talk about Morocco and Turkey in the past. Well, we have a very active program in Morocco where we have a partner who is evaluating in greenhouse berries and tomatoes production that gets exported into the EU. So we can access the EU market through berries that are tomatoes that are grown in North Africa in this case. So there are ways that we will be getting into the European market, either through Switzerland or these countries like Morocco or Turkey.
Our next question asks what the status of any third-party testing is.
Yeah, so this is, I think, speaking to the in-licensing, where we want to bring more products into our portfolio so we can control additional diseases beyond the diseases that our own Vectorite with CR7 controls. So last year in 2020, going back to 2019, we did something like, I want to say it was 7 or 9 products that we evaluated in our labs to make sure that they were compatible with our system and to make sure that bees actually carried the product on a very, lab scale basis. And then we took 4 of those products out for field studies in 2020, right? And we got great results. And we are in 2021, we're actively talking to 3 of those companies about possible commercial arrangements, right? So this would be a slightly different way of bringing a product to market, because we would be, in a sense, sharing the revenue from the grower between the 2 companies. But it's very exciting because this will allow us to claim other pests that we can control beyond what our Vectorite does. And in some cases, I should point out that 2 of these discussions are for Europe, where these 2 products are already registered in Europe, where we may have to do a little bit of work to get the bee use label, but the active ingredient itself is already registered. So in that scenario, we're talking about an accelerated entry to market. So those 2 European projects are very interesting also.
Great, thank you. One very popular question we're getting is about the bee population. So maybe you can speak a little bit about how the slow extinction of bees and bumblebees affect our business in the near future and the long term.
Yeah, I mean, of course, there's a lot that you can read up on this phenomenon called colony collapse, and there's many. Look, I'm not a bee expert myself, but obviously I go to conferences or I talk to people, and my understanding is that there's many causes for this danger for the bees, and one is things like climate change, and there's a varroa mite, which is a predatory mite that can go and decimate, I should say, the honeybee population. But then, of course, one area that's been identified is the use of chemicals by production agriculture, right? And chemical pesticides in particular. So of course, that's led to a series of bans on insecticides, called a whole class of chemistry called neonicotinoids are now being banned. But it's also now understood that overuse of chemical fungicides is coming back and hurting the health of the bee colonies. Now, what's interesting about our system is that by using our system, the bees are able to actually help themselves, because if an almond grower, for example, who's already using bees, can now also reduce the amount of chemical fungicides that are being sprayed because they're delivering a safe biological control agent, that colony at the end of the season is not going to have the same exposure to chemicals than in the past. So the bees are actually helping their own health. To very specifically answer the question about how does it impact our business, let me just say this. Bumblebees that are used in commercial production are pretty much produced to order. So these are not natural bumblebees that we're talking about. There are in North America, there's 2 global multinationals that are commercially rearing bumblebees, and they're selling them for pollination services. So we have partnerships with both those companies. They make a white label box to our specifications with our dispensers. And so there's really no risk on our bumblebee business because of these supply arrangements. And on the honeybee side, I mean, gosh, there's over 2 million honeybee hives that are used in the United States for pollination services. And that is more than enough to keep us busy for many, many decades. Also understanding that these same beehives will go and pollinate, different crops as the season goes. And they may start in California in almonds and in berries, and then move up the Pacific coast and do apples and cherries, and then move over to the Midwest and alfalfa and sunflowers, and then they move around, right? So that same beehive, we can kind of follow and deliver the biological control agent on those different crops. So really, I'm not worried about it at all. There's plenty of beehives for our business plan. And oh, by the way, longer term, we believe that our technology will actually help lessen the issues on colony collapse.
Great, thank you. Our next question states that they've noticed a bit of a decline in news concerning strawberries. Is this a crop that we are still actively targeting?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in fact, if you remember, I showed a slide about those bubbles and that sales adoption cycle, and you could see Florida, which was mostly a strawberry discussion, was still kind of a low customer count, even though we're in the third season there. And the reason for that is we've actually found out a lot of things about strawberries. One of the things that we found out is that growers just don't use bees, right? And they can't justify the extra cost of getting a beehive. And so it always comes back to a discussion around pricing of our system in strawberries. And we're at a point where we're seeing such tremendous uptake in raspberries and blackberries and blueberries, and we've done some work even in cranberries where bees are used, that we don't want to drop the price just to get access to the Florida strawberry market. The other thing that's happening in Florida strawberries is that overall market is shrinking because a lot of those berry acres are being moved to Mexico because frankly, they just cannot compete on the labor costs with Mexican berries. And also, as the California season is expanding, the time that berries are productive and profitable in Florida is shrinking. So it's a long answer to basically say that we have deprioritized strawberries in the Southeast. That being said, we believe we have opportunities, good opportunities for strawberries here in California, as well as in Mexico. So we are engaged with the big berry growers in these regions to really understand if there is an opportunity in the Pacific Coast or in Mexico for strawberries.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
Our next question states, based on the current active ingredients, BVT addresses a certain segment of flowering diseases.
Right.
How long will it take bee vectoring to provide a complete solution for flowering diseases? In essence, either through procuring or developing new active ingredients and getting approval. Alternatively, when can BVT achieve the status of sole solution provider for, say, blueberries or apple orchards during flowering seasons?
Oh boy, there's really two parts to that question. Let me answer the first part, which is more about, berries, for example. So that's where the in-licensing discussion comes in, right? So we have already identified, when we look at our, what diseases does Vectorite with CR7 control? And what are the other, not only diseases, but also insect pressures, so pests that affect the crop in and around the flower? We've got a short list of about 3 indications that we want to fill with different in-licensed products, right? One of them is the biological insecticide to control different plant bugs that feed and lay their eggs around the flower of a crop. It is, I think, realistic that in 2 to 3 years, we will have a solution for that in certain geographies, right? So it may be that we actually have the solution in Europe before we do in the US, but that's okay because we can start selling a BVT system with an insecticide in Europe before we sell one with CR7 in it. And then we bring that over to the US. And then once we have it in the US, we will then be able to package it together with Vectorite with CR7, and then through the one system, deliver both a plant disease control agent and a plant insect control agent, or flower insect control agent. So I think realistic timeline is 2 to 3 years. There is, like I said, obviously negotiations with these third parties that need to be had, and then maybe some additional field trial work, and there will be a regulatory step because even though that insecticide may have a registration for the active ingredient, it won't for our particular label use. So there will be a use pattern submission that we need to make, which is a shorter timeline. So I would say 2 to 3 years is the timeline there.
Excellent, thank you. Ashish, could you please highlight some of the next steps regarding the almond strategy in California?
Yeah. So, almonds are basically blooming right now. I live in Sacramento and they bloom pretty much from Sacramento down to Bakersfield in the Central Valley, and there's 1.2 million acres. And I was driving up and down that valley last week, and I could see these wonderful crops, trees blooming. We are in the process of securing, we have already secured a number of trials, and we'll be able to talk about it once we really, have them placed. But we are talking, our goals for this year are to do a full R&D study with an almond researcher that can really look at our system versus the current grower practice versus an untreated control to see, quantify the differences in a true replicated study. And this is, you design these in a similar way that a drug company would design a clinical trial, just to give folks an idea of the complexity, and they cost $15,000, $20,000. So we're in the process of doing one of those, securing one of those, and then also separately doing a more quote unquote hands-on practical commercial demo. And we hope that we will do that in at least 3 or 4 different almond orchards. So in a very short window, we've been very successful and have engaged with these almond growers. But beyond, and so we're very, very focused on that. In the coming days and weeks, we have to get that done. Once those grower demos and the R&D trial is underway, we already started a discussion with the Almond Board of California. We will hopefully take the learnings from these demos and the R&D trial and sit down with the Almond Board in California and maybe even make a proposal for funded research that they would pay to do further work in almonds. So it's not an easy crop because it is mind-boggling how many flowers bloom. I mean, there's something like 3 trillion flowers that bloom every February in almonds in California, right? 3 trillion with a T. And there are 2 million, beehives that are used to pollinate those 3 trillion flowers. So it comes down to a math number. Can we get enough Vectorite with CR7 delivered to enough of those flowers to make to control any diseases of concern? We believe the answer is yes, but it's going to take a little bit of time to validate it. So we're starting that journey this year, which is super exciting. And obviously we will keep folks informed as we progress across that journey.
Excellent, thank you. Our next question states, could you please talk a little bit about the relationship with BioBest, and are they part of our growth strategy for Europe?
Yeah, I mean, BioBest, so I alluded to 2 global multinationals that rear bumblebees. BioBest is one company and Copert is the other company. And so we have relationships with both of those, very strong relationships, not only here in the US, but at their global headquarters with their senior teams. BioBest is based in Belgium, Copert is based in the Netherlands. And we are talking to them not only to supply, there's a whole spectrum. We have supply arrangements with them in the US. They supply the bees for us here, but we're also talking to them about much more strategic partnerships. For example, for Europe, those are conversations that have occurred, as well as even deeper than that. So these are all active discussions. I can't really speak to the because there's confidentiality aspects to some of those, but these are good relationships with active discussions to explore a whole spectrum of different collaborations. But at a minimum, they are a supplier, and we have agreements for supply of bees for us in North America.
Great, thank you. We are pushing up towards the end of the time here, so I just want to say we will ask 1 or 2 more questions, time permitting. It's pretty amazing. We've received well over 100 questions so far. So for audience members that we haven't been able to get to your questions, please feel free to continue emailing us, and you can follow Virtus Advisory on Twitter, and we will do our best to respond to your questions. So our next question asks about the Biden administration. They're supposed to be very concerned with climate change and planning to make changes to combat it. As we use bees to deliver the crop disease fighting fungus, CR7, which is a green technology. Is the Biden administration beneficial? Have we reached out to them? Is there any potential opportunity there? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the Biden administration is dealing with COVID-19 rollout and vaccination rollouts. It's probably not the time to reach out to them right now. That being said, here's what we are doing. So I'm a member of, or actually BVT is a member of the Biologicals Product Industry Alliance. So this is the industry voice for biologicals, not chemical. There are some chemical companies that are in there, but because they have biological products. So this is the voice of the industry. And I'm actually a director of the board of directors of the BPIA. And our job is to advocate for these types of products. It's unlikely that you're going to be able to make any impact if you go in there and talk about one particular technology, right? But you can certainly go in as an industry association and talk about a class of products and try to make things happen. So through the BPIA, I've been to Capitol Hill many times over the last 5-6 years. Of course, we have very close relationships with the EPA. And what we do there is we advocate for biological products, and we will meet with key senators and Congress people that are members of the House Ag Committee or the Senate's Ag Committees, and we'll talk about the benefits of biologicals and how, in many cases, they are more environmentally sustainable than some of the chemicals. So we will continue that. We believe we will have a more receptive audience with the Biden administration for sure. But you know what? Politics is such a thing that every four years, the pendulum swings the other way. So all you can do is keep kind of plugging along, talking about your the benefit for your technology. But we have been able to make concrete benefits at the EPA, where biological products, certainly in the US, are now the registration burden on biological products is much lower than for a chemical because of some of the efforts the industry has engaged with the agency. So there are concrete steps that we can make that we will participate in.
Great, thank you. Our final question will be, what are our sales plans for the next 1 to 3 years? And then do we continue to plan to have margin of up to 70%?
Yeah, so we in fiscal 2020, which ended in October, we announced we released our results a couple 3 weeks ago. We had about just under $300,000 in revenue and a 40% gross margin. I've already indicated that our target on revenue is $1 million invoiced plus committed in the next 12 months. That number, our objective is to get to $3 to $5 million in a couple of years. So that's the revenue journey. And then in 2 to 3 years, a few things will start happening. One is we will be at a point where we will be able to start the launch and expansion phases in almonds, right? Because in the first 2 to 3 years, it's going to be mostly a berry-driven revenue story. Bigger crops like almonds will take that 2 to 3 years to start kicking in, and that's when you'll see that. In addition, you'll start seeing Mexico approval and having an impact. And for sure, we should be in Switzerland by then, maybe Morocco, Turkey, and on our way in Europe, maybe an in-licensed product. So in 2 to 3 years, we want to get to $3 to $5 million in revenue just in the US. But at that point, you're going to start seeing an acceleration in revenue because of these other revenue streams that will be coming online. So that's our plan. Of course, we have to do a lot of work between now and then. We've got a great team with a lot of experience, over 100 years of experience in crop protection. And what's great is now that we are commercial, we also have industry partners that are taking a look at us and are showing a keen level of interest to partner with us kind of and we need to negotiate win-win agreements with them.
Excellent, thank you. Well, that's all the time we have for today. So I will hand it back over to you to provide any closing remarks, and we can finish up here.
Yeah, no, I think I really wanted to thank everybody for their participation, and very importantly, the fact that we had over 100 questions shows that people are very interested in engaging with us. We will do our best to try to answer as many of those as possible. The big takeaway that I want to leave with everybody is this company is now in a very different stage than we were as recently as a year or so ago. We are a fully deployed company, if you will. And by that, what I mean is, I can actually give coordinates, GPS coordinates, and people can drive to fields in the US, mostly the Southeast, but later this year, Pacific Northwest, California, and the Midwest, where you can actually see farmers using our system. And these are not R&D trials anymore. These are full-blown sales. And that's an extremely exciting stage to be in. And we're really excited to not take our learnings from the US and multiply it in other regions around the world, and really grow BVT into a game-changing crop production system for farmers around the world. So wanted to thank everybody for their involvement, and happy that they're part of the BVT family.